welcome to the first episode of Homestart Hall's podcast, also called PADcast.
And introducing is Lucy,
Calvin,
Matt,
Gemma.
I'm Kieran, and I'm joining you from the laptop on a virtual call.
So the purpose of PADs is to provide peer support for partners and dads. It's to get dads more aware that there's a service out there for them. And it's getting dads talking to each other as well and more aware that there's something out there for them. And don't be afraid to ask for help. And there's support out there in a comfortable, safe environment where they can talk to other dads as well about their experiences of being a dad. So we'll start off with, I'm Lucy. I'm the Partner and Dads Peer Support Coordinator for Homestart in Hull. And I'll pass you over to you.
So I'm Calvin. I'm an early help family support worker based at Fenchurch Family Hub, so working in the west of Hull City in general.
I'm Matt. I'm the community lead for Renew, which is a drug and alcohol treatment service.
And this is the bit everyone hates because by the time it's got round to you, you've forgotten who you are. I am Gemma. I am the Digital and Fundraising Officer at Homestart Hull.
And last but not least...
I'm Kieran. I'm the Operations Manager for Dad Matters UK, which is a Homestart project. I'm based in Greater Manchester. I'm sat in Bolton and it's really sunny, which is very strange for Manchester. But we have Dad Matters projects all over the UK, from Somerset to Blackpool to Leeds to Surrey and Suffolk and some other places down south that I can't pronounce.
So do you want to tell us, Kieran, what it is that your service does? Because you're Homestart Host, aren't you?
Yes, so Homestart Host, we're working with an early attachment service in Tameside, one of the areas of Greater Manchester, about 7 years ago, on a PIMS project where they were offering home visiting peer support for perinatal parents, supporting mental health, attachment and bonding, all that kind of stuff. And the outcomes were really good, but they didn't see dads in the project at all. They only really worked with mums, even though it was open to both parents. So they got some funding for an innovation project to try and work with dads on parent-infant mental health. And they advertised it as a dad champion role. That was the title of it. I was really interested in it and applied. And then at interview, really talked about my experiences working in children's centres, developing dads programmes, and how there was a lot of assumptions about what dads wanted, and consultation with dads is always a bit problematic, and that we could do something very different to reach dads with education, information, networking, and ultimately peer support, and how that might look different to what Homestart usually offer in terms of like home visiting probably isn't as appropriate. And the way that we do one-to-one support might be a bit different, and volunteering is a bit different, just because the way men engage with services. So we developed it from that, and we have 3 layers to it, where we do outreach and universal engagement, education, information, resources. Then we also do targeted outreach, where we meet dads in neonatal units, prisons, rainbow clinics, mother and baby units, lots of other places. And then we take one-to-one referrals and do work with dads where they get the opportunity to offload, think about the baby within the midst of what's going on for them, and then developing lots of other kind of avenues and signposting and referral pathways for them.
So I'm just going to start off with is, what advice would you give to new dads? Kieran, I'll start with you.
So it's really difficult to give dads new advice because they're not expecting to get advice usually. I think some of the main ones would be around checking in with how you're feeling, what that means to you and how that presents itself to you is really important, because one of the symptoms of men having mental health issues is avoidance, and that includes avoiding the things that we're struggling with. So being able to check in with yourself is really important. The next thing is that dads, as our mums, are all learning. Nobody knows how to do this when a baby's born. We all have to figure it out. But dads are as capable and important as mums in baby's development from before baby's born. So knowing that you're important is also the next bit. And then finally, it's knowing that your interaction with your baby and your positive responsiveness will build your baby's brain. It physically builds the brain and it develops what they need to develop. And how you feel intuitively is the way to parent. Dads have hormonal changes when partners are pregnant, which is a really, it's a bit of a concept that's really hard to grasp for a lot of men, because we assume our partners are going to have that. But when your testosterone levels drop because your partner's pregnant, and then they drop again when your baby cries, but then they rise really high when your baby does a prolonged cry, and then you start to feel frustrated or angry or upset and not able to cope. All of that is totally natural parenting for dads. It's just different to mums, and we need to learn what it means for us.
See, I found this out a few weeks ago, that obviously, like, your body changes, a male's body actually changes and goes through the same concept as your partners do, hormones and stuff like that. I was like, oh my God, I'm real fascinated in stuff like this.
Has anyone else experienced it? Like, have you guys?
I can't say I recognise or remember the sort of physical changes, but just to continue on what you were saying there, Kieran, I went to a conference in Durham about working with dads and male carers just before Christmas. And something that, there was a project up there, Young Lads and Dads, and I think one of the things he said that really stuck with me was, it's never celebrated being a young dad. The first question is like, well, what are you going to do? And you've ruined your life, and how's this going to impact? And he's like, whereas actually it needs to be celebrated. Not everybody gets the luxury to become a dad at any age. So I think sort of the first bit of advice is appreciate it. And it's not the end of the world. There are many people that have, become parents early that have actually still made themselves happy. So I do think that's really important, and I think the advice, going back to the sort of question, is any advice and any support that's there that should be taken. And I say to a lot of people I work with, especially dads, there's no idiot's guide to parenting. There's an idiot's guide to riding a bike, to learning French, or doing a lot of things, but for parenting there isn't one. And it's almost like you're expected to go from, right, I'm going to be a parent, to and I know what I should be doing. And if it's your first time as well, it's like, well, how are you supposed to know if you've got no experience, or if you've not necessarily got the support with your parents or whatever around you? It's important to just realise that there's things out there. And it's just asking that question, is what is there for me?
What do you think?
Honestly, in terms of advice, these are the sort of things that I was, scrolling on my phone at 2 a.m. doing a night feed, looking for people, because
go to Google.
Do you know what? It sounds awful, because my daughter's 2 now, and I absolutely love her to bits. But she was born the 27th of December, and I remember I was having to return a few Christmas items, and I was looking at my daughter thinking, God, I wish she came with a receipt, because I was so overwhelmed by it, and I was like. Going back to the age thing, I thought being 30, having a full-time job, a stable income, having a house, all these things that I met my wife when I was 19. So had we got pregnant early, I was in a position where I had all these things that I wanted to make sure I had before I had a baby. But even still, I was just completely overwhelmed by it all. And I remember one of the first times I took her out, my neighbour walked up to me, and obviously seen me, overwhelmed by it. She said, I can tell you now. Yeah, stressing out. I can tell you now, it doesn't get any easier, but it doesn't get any harder either. You just deal with different challenges at different ages. And that was the one thing that really stuck in my mind. And I've always thought about this, even now. I think I'm just hitting that 2-year sleep regression now, because the past few nights she's not going to bed, she's waking up all the time. Last night was the first night that I'd actually got a full night's sleep in about 4 or 5 days, so I'm hoping we're coming towards the end of it now.
Where's the teenagers?
This is it. These are the things, these are the things, I'm looking at this thinking, God, how did I used to do those night feeds multiple times? Yeah. Because, my wife never admitted it, but she had a bit of postnatal depression as well to begin with, and I think I didn't even know men could get postnatal depression, but I was so low, and I think I tend to have that, is it the seasonal affective disorder anyway? So January time after Christmas, I normally hit quite a low there anyway. And then I've got this little baby. I don't feel like I can leave the house. So I was just completely overwhelmed by the entire thing, really. And I've just found that time is one of the best things, because, as we were saying then, I don't know, I've kind of had this expectancy that my wife would just know what to do.
Yeah.
And when we came,
I realised that pretty quickly.
You and go.
I realised that pretty quickly when we got back. When we got back from the hospital and we'd put the car seat on the floor. There was a moment where we looked at each other and just thought, now what? And I'm looking at her and she's looking at me. Yeah. And the one thing I realised pretty quickly is that we're just learning all the time. And I thought, one of my friends said this to me. He said, "You've got to understand." He said, "To you, that baby has just been a concept for the last 9 months, and then you're given it, and it's like, okay, it's a real thing." He said, whereas with your wife, she's actually felt every kick, every movement. So she's had time to adjust. And I said this to her, like, and she went, no, it's as much as a reality hit to me as it is to you. It's like, now here's this massive responsibility.
I was entirely convinced it was still biscuits until she was born. Yeah. It was just a food baby. Yeah. I had to have that scan to confirm I hadn't been overeating.
Yeah. A couple of my friends have had children in the last sort of year as well, and there was a conversation about like nappies and stuff, and he was saying, "Oh, I don't do nappies." I was like, "What do you mean you don't do nappies?" Like, "Oh, I don't do nappies." And I remember getting really angry about it. I was like, "Do the effing nappies!" I was like, "Get stuck in," because these are all the things. It's all bonding. And now I have such a. I mean, my wife's handled it really well, but at the moment, all she ever wants is me. She wakes up in the morning. When she wakes up in the night, when we're going through this little regression phase, she's shouting at me. She's shutting the door on her, and she honestly said, "I'm not worried about it." She said, "I know it's just a phase. It'll be fine." Whereas if that was the other way around, I think I would feel really pushed out by it. But my point being now, to think of where I am with her and that relationship I've got with her, I never thought I'd have that 2 years ago when she was first born. I was just, again, rabbiting constantly, just didn't know how to handle this entire situation, really.
That's a really good point you make, though. Like, I'm aware the family hubs are quite responsive in the 1001 days, and that's the understanding that the first 1001 days of a child's life are where the most development occurs, and it's where anything that happens forms who they are as a person and how they grow up. And so you said as well that she's 2.
Yeah.
So obviously the first 1001 days is 2 years.
That's why you've got that.
Yeah, and it's really important that dads also get stuck into these things because of the bonding, like you've just said, because they form major points in a child's development.
Well, that was my experience when I was reading all these things that, again, during these night feeds, and that was when I was at my worst, I think, 2 a.m. trying to get her to sleep. And I think as well, I took on, not more responsibility as such, but the day after I got home from hospital, I passed out. My wife had just gone to bed. It was probably the first rest that she'd had, and I was downstairs and I put her in the little Moses basket thing, and I felt really hot and I passed out. Anyway, I did a test and it turned out I had COVID, and I thought this was why I was passing out. So it was still pretty new then, do you know what I mean? I think we're a lot more understanding of COVID now than we was, say, 2 years ago. But my wife actually took my daughter and moved in with her parents whilst I was isolating. And do you know what? I was so thankful as well. I'd only been with her 24 hours at this point, but I was so thankful to be getting what I was considering a break. But when she came back, because I was getting the updates of how hard she was having it by herself, I was like, right, now I have to step up. And I was doing not more, but I was trying to do everything as well. Turned out, I don't think it was COVID that was the reason why I passed out. I think it was just anxiety. I think it was shock, because funny thing, after 10 days and even tested negative, she came back, she woke up in the night, and I darted out of bed to go to her, and literally I passed out straight away. Yeah. So the doctor said it was postural hypertension. He said you're standing up too quickly. But I think it was an element of anxiety, being overwhelmed. And there I was, just in the middle of the night, just hitting the deck. Yeah. But I've always done that. So it's because I wasn't with her for that first week, I've always tried to do more and more and more. And I think that's kind of why I do have this relationship with her now. I'm not saying I do everything.
Like conscious.
But it's like I've constantly had to like go. I hate saying things like going above and beyond, because I'm not. I'm just doing what I'm supposed to be doing.
You're just being a dad.
I'm just being a dad. Yeah, I'm just being a dad, which is it's a lot. But I think that's why we do have such a good bond as well. Is because I am doing all those. I don't. Again, it sounds like I say I'm doing extra things. I'm not. I'm doing the dad things, But I think this is the reason why it feels like that is because when you look around to your friends and you read stuff, and again, going back to what I was saying, it was about the lack of help or knowledge for dads. Everything I was reading at 2 a.m. in the morning when I was doing these night feeds, it was all from the perspective of mums.
Yes.
And I'm reading advice from things that was posted on an old forum in 2010, and I'm thinking, God, I'm reading this story about some child who's not sleeping. I'm like, your child's 12 now. Do you know, it's like looking at the timestamps. I was like, it's so weird trying to find advice and knowledge in stuff that was posted 10 years ago, but seeing how, I guess the point being that how much, even though these children change, how much the time has gone on and how much that child would have changed, the circumstances are still happening to newer parents all the time. So what I was experiencing was, in a way, I was feeling like I was the only dad in the world.
Yeah.
And you're not, do you know what I mean? But it was just, I couldn't find anyone that could relate to those feelings that I was experiencing.
Yeah. And from that as well, do you know when you did become first, like what services was actually out there for you, like say like for your mental health for dads, and your worries, where would you go when you become dads?
I think from my own experience, because I know when my first was born, because I have two, I remember that immediate moment of freezing and thinking, I've got to kind of put a nappy on, I've got to get dressed. I'm like, what do I do? Like, he's small, tiny, like, what? Luckily, my partner had her friend with her, which obviously made that so much easier. But I think my saving grace, when I reflect on it and have these conversations, was because I've worked in this sort of industry, I knew where I could go. But I think actually if I was to not know what I knew, I'd be like, well, I don't know. Like, nobody kind of had that conversation to sort of signpost me. Like, apart from going to midwife appointments, it was like, well, I know where that is, but I work there. And other than that, there was no sort of bridged gap. And I think to an extent, I relied on my partner because she'd already had a daughter from a previous relationship. It was almost like, well, she'll just guide me through. Yeah. You know, I can be involved, but she'll just guide me through. And it's like, right, well, this is what we need to do. And she said to me very early stages, she was like, you need to get them into a routine as early as you can. And I was like, well, why is a baby? Like, what sort of routine we put in place for a baby? And actually, it was the best bit of advice I did get. But again, that wasn't from service, that was from my partner. So it's really hard to sort of imagine what I could have got or what could have been there if I wasn't working in it. I think we're getting better. Like I think we've mentioned, the Family Hub model is there to help, and I know there is an increase in promotion for dads and male carers, which I think helps, but I still think there's a long way to go when we look at other areas of the country that seem to be further ahead or further down the line than we are with regards to actually saying this is universally aware for people.
Would you say, like, do you know, when you go to your maternity appointments, are there, because I know they're trying to do better in midwives giving you more information, actually speaking to dad, not just mum, while they're in the room? Do you feel like that's a slow process? Or?
Again, I think it's work in progress, but I think whether it's the male psyche, but you sort of go to a midwife appointment, but you're there to make sure that everything's okay with mum and baby. So it's almost like I didn't feel anyways that you were sort of there for you. It was sort of like that reassurance that everything's okay. If you got told that things weren't good, it was like, okay, like warning signals are flashing away, like this isn't what I was told to expect. It's like you go to your midwife appointment, you check everything's all right, you move on, the rest of the day continues. But I also think, midwives now, I think they're being asked to promote more, to have more conversations. That it must be really hard for them to have the same conversation over and over again without something being missed somewhere down the line.
Kieran, how are you finding it where you are? Because you're the Manchester area, and I know you said, Calvin, it might be better in different parts of the country. Like, how is it comparable
to Hull? Because obviously Hull is like still starting off in it, like, but obviously, like Gemma said, there's Manchester's big city. It's maybe in front of us and stuff. So
Well, I'll give you my personal experience, if that's okay.
That's fine.
Maternity care.
Go for it.
It really informs what Dad Matters does. So when I was 19, I became a dad, and unfortunately, the baby died from Group B strep, and there was no support for me. I wasn't asked how I was. I wasn't even told what the infection was. I was just left. And a little bit like somebody said earlier on, I relied on my partner to give me the information that I needed to have. And then I became a dad again at 21, so a few years later. And all the way through the pregnancy, I was worried about Group B strep. I found out what it was called during one of the antenatal appointments for my second child. And then during labour, and when we were admitted to the hospital, there were some discrepancies or miscommunications about what the treatment would be during labour. And it ended up that my partner didn't have the treatment that she needed to have. That for me was very traumatic, although the birth itself for my partner wasn't as traumatic. It wasn't a traditional traumatic birth, if you like. There weren't complications, and baby was fine, mum was fine, and they stayed in hospital and were monitored. But for me, I spent months worrying about it, and then 12 hours in the hospital, and the only thing I could think of was that I was going to lose a baby. So then a good few years after that, I had another baby who is 17 now, so she's not really a baby anymore.
She's your baby though still.
The birth was the same. There was miscommunications about the treatment, and she didn't end up having the IV that she needed, and I felt really traumatized by it. But I worked in children's centres and I worked with midwives and health visitors on a regular basis, and I felt empowered enough to talk to them afterwards about why did this happen, how did this happen, what could I have done about it, what can I think about in the future. But crucially, the only place that I got support from was my own dad, who had no idea about how to support me with this because he hadn't been through it, and from an uncle who wanted to support me, but again, didn't really have any knowledge or lived experience of losing a child and then experiencing traumatic birth. There was no service that reached out to me. There was no service that offered me any kind of debrief service or counselling. I had to go and find it myself. The only ones that I could find were generic counselling services within talking therapies. There was no specific parenting ones, no perinatal ones, and it felt really isolating. So when we set up Dad, I also managed the programs in the children's centres, and if we didn't have any dads in for a particular month or quarter, I'd put on a messy play session on a Saturday morning with bacon butties, and I wouldn't even advertise it to dads. I'd just tell the mums that came in the centre, and the dads would turn up on a Saturday and we would fill the group, and it was great. But none of the dads in the group needed support. And as a dad myself, I didn't feel comfortable in the group as a dad. I wouldn't go there to share my story or get peer support or talk to people about it or even access a service from it, because it was general and it was really needed for the dads that went and for the mums who sent the dads. But for me, it didn't feel appropriate. So leading us to what Dad Matters does, we're very clear that we always go to the dads. We don't invite them to us. You mentioned before, you're following us on Facebook, you'll see what dads want us to share, not what we actually do. So we don't talk about our referrals. We don't talk about our one-to-one processes. We don't talk about the training we develop for professionals. We only talk about the things that dads want to hear, which is, I might be feeling like this. What does it mean? Where can I get support for this particular issue? Where can I go? And all of that leads dads down the path of acknowledging that there's a problem and then knowing where to go when there is, because we don't often acknowledge that there is an issue. We just, as was said, we're concentrating on mum, we're concentrating on the baby, and everything around that isn't relevant to us unless somebody tells us that it's about mum and baby. So we need to develop it a bit more. So in Greater Manchester, because we've been here now for 7 years, we deliver lectures for the student midwives and health visitors at universities. We do training for all of the teams in all of those services. All of our referrals come from perinatal teams and mental health services, excuse me, and midwives, health visitors and specialists. So we're embedded in the pathway now. And if they don't think about dads, it's because they've not come across us. So it's very rare that they're not asking dads how they are and not signposting to us. And that's why we see so many dads in the spaces that are universal for us.
Yeah. Sorry, go on.
Can I ask a really personal question?
Yeah.
And if you don't want to answer, I understand. So we lost a baby a few years ago. And the sheer thought of having any other children filled me with utter dread. And then I've since sort of found out that, it's never something, if you lose as a dad, whether you're with the current partner or new partner, nothing gets flagged up that you have previously lost. And it can come across as almost quite controlling behaviour if you're asking loads of questions. How did you sort of have the conversation with your partner around, are we ready to try for another child? Because the conversation with me and my partner was very much, I shut it down. She went through it really hard to begin with. And I think I probably kind of carried on with Knife because I had my two boys, and it was a case of, I just want to keep normality for them. But then the idea if she mentioned it later on, I was like, no. Wasn't even willing to contemplate it. And the only support I found at the time, which really reduced, and I don't want it to sort of, I'm not going to flag up the service, was by playing football with some friends. And that's purely because I knew somebody that played at the time. And I thought, okay, well, that's kind of my option. And it was my partner that actually said to me, you should message them and you should do it. But how did you have that conversation to sort of say, right, are we looking, planning ahead sort of thing?
I think at 19, we weren't really planning anything. I took her lead on everything. Whatever she needed or wanted, I would go with. And whatever the people around her wanted for her, like services or family, I would just respect what they were saying. They were the experts in my eyes, so I would just do what they wanted. And I was very, I think I was very complacent in what I wanted. I didn't really think about it until we were pregnant. And then I worried about everything and didn't talk to her about any of it. Even after the baby was born, I still didn't talk to her about it. Our relationship broke down for a number of years after our first baby, our first living baby was born. And we got back together a few years later, and then had another one. And a lot of that was down to communication. There wasn't any. And support for me to talk somewhere. The only thing I could think of was clinical support, so GP. And I would go to the GP, and anything that they recommended wasn't specialist. It was only the generic pathways that men can access. And it was very light touch, and it didn't feel very supportive. It was just me offloading, which was useful, but it wasn't really what I needed. I needed somebody that would understand more about what I've been through. And I think we work now in Greater Manchester with dads who've experienced loss. We take referrals from the maternal mental health service where there's loss or birth trauma. And we have a member of staff who's absolutely excellent, and he runs a closed Facebook group with a messenger chat for these dads, and he does walk and talks on a Saturday for dads to come along to. And we signpost to those kinds of football teams that support loss, and other organisations that do things around that. But there's not one size that fits everyone, and there has to be something else as well. I love football, but I don't go to football to talk about my loss or my mental health. I go to escape that stuff. So for me, finding social football was great, and I go and do that regularly, and it helps my mental health now to be maintained. But I wouldn't go there to talk about it. And I think sometimes we use those kinds of organisations to avoid thinking about how do we fix it. We're just avoiding it by being somewhere else for a bit, and that's not always successful. Not saying that they're not successful; they do amazing work, but it's not always for everyone.
But thank you for sharing that, both of you, anyway, because I know it's a bit of a sore subject, but it is quite baby losses on the rise, and the enough support for you guys out there that you can go to. So like counsellor sessions, they do say you can go to counsellor sessions, but not actually something that can really help you with your mental health and the fears as well, like you've just said, both of you, of having that child, having another child. What would you want to see moving forward with this around this subject of baby loss? Of what do you think needs to do more of for guys? Because obviously mums do get a lot of help with baby loss, don't they? But what about the guys? What would you say, Calvin?
It's a tough one to know what I'd like to see.
Or what you'd want to see, kind of thing.
I'd quite, from when I found out that it's not flagged up on the system, for want of a better phrase, that as a male you've lost, even if it's with a new partner, I'd quite like for that to be universally recognised, because you could quite easily come across, and I guess it's for yourself, Kieran, it's probably more relevant, if you've got certain aspects or the cause, you want that reassurance. And I think actually with ours, because there wasn't anything, it's like, well, I could come across as controlling because I want to know, is this okay? Is that okay? But are you sure? And it's not because I'm doubting people. It's just because actually, if you knew, then I'd be in a position where I'm like, well, that's why. So I think because that shocked me, and I'm going to say in the recent past, I think something like that, universally would be a certain step in the right direction. But gosh, what do I want to see going forward? It's hard because you hear there's other, like you say, there's other social support networks for dads and males, which I think do a fantastic job. But I think it's such a personal thing for people to talk about that actually, like you say, sometimes you go to these things because you want to improve your emotional well-being, your mental health, but actually you don't want to talk about the biggest thing that's affecting it. Yeah. So I don't honestly know the answer off the top of my head.
No. What do you think, Kieran?
I think actually the things that will help the most is more equitable access to therapy, to pathways within services. Things like most areas now have perinatal priority access for dads. So if they have a child under 2, they can access the priority pathway for IAPT, for mental health services, which is fantastic because that's where you need to be if there's an issue that's specific and you need to talk about it. But also we need to educate everyone, mums as well as professionals and dads, about the importance of dads in the baby's life, because the more they know about that, the more they get rid of all of that gatekeeping that happens, that social messaging that dads are not as important as mums, because when it comes to babies' development, mums and dads are equal. They are as important as each other, and they're different. They're not doing the same job twice. They're doing different jobs together, and we can educate everyone to do more of that. That'd be the other bit. And I think, and this speaks to what we were saying about how dads are not flagged as having a particular experience. The record keeping that we have in this country is for mum, because it's mum that starts the journey with maternity, and when the baby arrives, baby is added to mum. That means that dad can't have any of those notes because mum's added to baby's notes. They have to redact all the information. It also means that there's no information about dad on there unless it's genetically important. Usually they might ask about dad and who's in the house and who's around. That's all to do with safeguarding rather than supporting the dad or any of that. So we need a real overhaul of all of our record keeping, data collection from maternity all the way through to early years, because at the moment dads are left out, and that's sending the message that dads are not as important.
Yeah, and it's as well, it's not just mum losing baby, it's you guys as well in it as well. You're affected with it as well. Matt, what do you on your line of work with stuff like that?
Yeah,
what do you say?
It's obviously we see the different element of it from, as we're saying, then from a safeguarding perspective. That's things that we do flag these things up, obviously. But I think that's really interesting. I think if I was to think in an ideal world, what we'd like to see is if there was improvements on the way that data was kept. If you know, if a male does lose the baby as well, I think there should be an attached sort of bereavement service attached to it that is sent out. And I think one of the things as well with support, which I always find interesting, and it's something that we do often in our line of work, is just because someone doesn't want the help immediately doesn't mean they won't want the help in the future. So often you find that a call will be made, do you want some additional support? And they'll say no, because they don't want it at that time. Maybe there's too much going on. But you might find 3 to 6 months later, they will need that support. So I always think it's worth, like, I've got a bit of like a sort of a green amber list sort of thing, you know. At first, if they don't want to receive support, I always say it's worth checking up again in another 3 months' time. And I think with mental health, especially with things like this, something like that would be so important, because I don't think the reality of situations hits you instantly, does it? No. Sometimes it's not until like a few months later. And going for what I went through, I was obviously having a lot of mental health problems around that time in terms of, you know, depression, feeling overwhelmed. It sounds awful now, because there was this running thought going through my head of my family, my wife and my daughter would be better off without me. I'm a hindrance here, because I was that overwhelmed by it. And I remember after about 3 or 4 weeks, I put in a referral for mental health support. By the time they got back round to me, I was actually doing a lot better. It was like 3 months later or something, you know. It was a long time, and by that point, honestly, I feel much better now than I did, you know. And it was a process, and time was the healer. But in the opposite way, I think some people will feel immediately okay because the reality of the situation hasn't hit them, but 3 to 6 months later it will. And I think it's important that as these guys were saying, you know, the way data collection is kept, but follow-up support is important, and time works, in different ways for different people. Sometimes people feel better given time. Some people feel much worse. I think when we look at trauma, often when we experience something traumatic, we don't register it as traumatic. It could be years later where we look back at something and we think, actually, that wasn't supposed to happen, or that shouldn't have happened to me, or because we normalise it.
You start thinking,
Things are normalised often instantly, and I think especially with our line of work in substance misuse, there is a high percentage of people with addictions that have experienced some form of childhood trauma. But the interesting part is they've normalised it throughout their teenage years of what they experienced as children was normal, but it's not until when they're adults where maybe they're communicating with other people where like, oh, that didn't happen to you? Oh, this wasn't part of your and it's like, okay, wow. And then that's when the trauma of it starts to set in, when you realise it isn't...
when you start talking about it.
When you start talking about it and you get reactions and it's like everyone suddenly thinks it's weird that happened. So I think in a way, I think time is important, and again, just because someone doesn't need help instantly doesn't mean they won't need help in the future.
Mm. Oh, well, thank you for sharing your experiences with that anyway. I know it's a sore subject.
It's a very heavy subject.
Yeah. What are your challenges that you've faced, encountered, positive or negative, of being a dad? Calvin, it's over to you.
The challenges, oh gosh. The challenges, I think, from my own, like I said before, my own experience is not knowing, and that moment of freezing when my eldest was born, and quite literally, as people have said to me in the past, your life changes. Mm-hmm. It's like, right, okay, you go from, it's a pregnancy. I know what's going to happen at the end of the pregnancy. Oh my God, it's happened. What on earth do we do? Life is completely different. And you are solely responsible for this little human and offering them the best start to life. And for life, you are the guidance that they need. Mm-hmm. So my biggest challenge was definitely knowing what to do. I think if my partner hadn't have had a child, and like I said, I didn't know what I know now, I almost dread to think where I would be or the support we'd access, because I think I've been very fortunate in that sense. But yes, I don't know. But the strength is that sheer moment of pride. And this little human, or as I have two now, are just the simple things, like every time I take them to bed now, they're 8 and 6, and every night I can put them to bed and I go and sit at the top of the stairs, because heaven forbid you leave a child for too long.
They hear the carpet move.
They will tell me, and I know they do this to test me, they will sit there and go, I love you, Dad. And you can almost think, right, so if I don't say anything, you're going to know I've gone. But no, I say, like, love you too, love you more. No, you don't. I love you the most. No, I love you more. Mummy, who loves who more?
Are you saying this when you're walking down the stairs? So it's like...
No, I sit there, and then to be fair, within 5 minutes they're both asleep, but it's always that thing of, they'll always say it first. And I think, do you know what? Like, I don't make them say that. It's the fact that they both sit there lying in bed and go, love you, Dad. And I think that's just an overwhelming moment of pride.
Well, thank you guys for joining us and sharing your experiences and your thoughts around different subjects, and come and join us on our next one.